Hello and welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. I'm Kermit Whitfield, a member of CMC's Board of Trustees and Senior AVP of Communications at United Way of Central Ohio. It's great to see everyone today, and it's great to see a full room here. Today, CMC presents Political Megatrends for Ohio 2018 and Beyond, sponsored by Hannah News Service and Ohio Farm Bureau Federation. Won't you please help me thank them and welcome Yvonne Lasisko, Vice President of Public Policy at the Ohio Farm Bureau Federation, to introduce our speakers. Yvonne?
Thank you, Kermit. I am Yvonne Lasisko, Vice President of Public Policy at Ohio Farm Bureau. We're proud to support the mission of the Columbus Metropolitan Club as they convene weekly public conversations important to community topics. We're proud to support today's lunch, but our over 140,000 Farm Bureau members are proud to support your breakfast, lunch, and dinner every day. Next week, on May 8th, Ohioans are likely to pass State Issue 1, the Congressional Redistricting Procedures Amendment, as an amendment to the Ohio Constitution. This will provide for a fairer and more balanced, bipartisan process to establish congressional districts beginning January 1st, 2021. This is a significant step forward. But there are also other forces at work in Ohio that will continue to change the political landscape, for better or for worse, in years to come. So let's explore those issues today with our experts. Please welcome the managing editor of Sabato's Crystal Ball, Kyle Kondik. Partner at Public Opinion Strategies, Neil Newhouse. And Chief of Staff of the Ohio Statehouse News Bureau, our very own Karen Kasler. Karen?
Was saying to Neil, I'm having a little deja vu here. I feel like I'm back in 2006. Anyone else, if you remember 2006? We were calling that the year of the outsider. Endorsements weren't necessarily considered positives in that year. Some candidates were running against Republican Governor Bob Taft, and there was a nasty and expensive ad war for the Republican nomination for governor, and at the end, conservative Ken Blackwell defeated more moderate Jim Petro for the nomination. And also, interestingly, Sandra O'Brien beat incumbent treasurer Jeanette Bradley in that race. So then in November, Democrat Ted Strickland handed Blackwell a 36-point loss, which was the fourth worst performance for a candidate for governor in Ohio history. Democrats nearly ran the table. They took Attorney General, they took Secretary of State, Treasurer, U.S. Senator. The only office they didn't take was Auditor. We'll get back to that one in just a minute. Democrats took control of the House in 2008, and President Barack Obama won in 2008 and 2012. But the Democrats' wins didn't last long, and Strickland only lasted one term. There was a little bit of a scandal in the Attorney General's office, and then that led up to this Republican tsunami in 2010.
Is there a question?
Yeah, there is a question. I'm just setting up the history here. What I think is interesting here is there are a lot of familiar faces. Like I said, the one candidate who won in 2006, Mary Taylor, who was auditor, she's here, back. Mike DeWine lost the U.S. Senate seat, he's back. Richard Cordray became the treasurer last year, that year, he's back. Dennis Kucinich was in between presidential campaigns that year, so he won his 6th term in Congress. And even Sandra O'Brien, she's on the ballot again as treasurer in the Republican primary. So I want to ask you both, you've got a long history here. Going from there to now, is this a setup for what happened in 2006 to happen again? Or based on what you're seeing, is there something different that's going to happen?
I think the key thing you need to remember is that it's an indication of how boring politics is in Ohio, that people keep recycling through. What comes around goes around. No, I don't think. I think 2006, as a Republican pollster, whenever I think about 2006, I have to take like antacids. I mean, it's heartburn medicine. I mean,
I'm glad I asked about this.
I know, yeah. I mean, I go back to 1982 to 2006, all these midterm elections where you're on the wrong side of the wave. I always think of 10 and 14 when on the right side of the wave, everything goes really well. It's easy running campaigns. You get the wind at your back. But when you're in the midterm election and you're going against a tide, these campaigns are extraordinarily tough, and it's like you're campaigning uphill. I tell candidates it's like the opponent starting on your 40-yard line, you're trying to stop them. Great analogy for Ohio, by the way. But it is going to be it is a much different political environment. It is an anti-incumbent, anti-status quo, and you see that in the primaries being played out for governor, where the two Democratic candidates, Kucinich and Cordray, are kind of fighting to get to the left, and you see on the Republican side the real knockdown, drag-out between Mary and DeWine. But there's a lot of tension on both sides, and it's going to play out not just next Tuesday, but in November as well. We have a long ways to go. This is it's a classic midterm election. It's going to be for those of you who like negative advertising, you're in for a real treat.
Or even a lot of it.
Yeah.
That's actually a great point about what we're seeing in Ohio right now, in that there's this, not only these potentially very brutal primaries on both sides for governor, but also there's this battle for the Ohio House speakership going on that has been just brutal and has been going on for a while now. And of course we have the now former speaker, Cliff Rosenberger, had to leave under suspicion of FBI investigation. That leads to, I think Democrats usually need some help to win in Ohio, at least at the state political level. You think about when Democrats have won the governorship in the state before 2006, horrible year for Republicans all across the country. Governor Taft, I think, had single-digit approval or low double-digit approval. You also had the Coingate scandal with Tom Noe. You go back to 82 when Celeste first won. That was a horrible recession. 58 when Democrats won the governorship, horrible recession. 1970 scandal.
You can't be that old.
I'm a historian, but the point is that there may be certain factors sort of coming together that could help the Democrats win in Ohio this year, and I think national environment is probably going to be there for them to at least some degree, and also, who knows what may come out of all this stuff going on at the Statehouse. Whether voters care about it, who knows, but maybe it becomes bigger in the fall than it maybe is now.
I think one of the factors that certainly we can all point to is the Trump factor. And, the messaging that you talk about in the negative ads, there's a lot of comparisons of who is more conservative and a lot of criticism that the opponent isn't as much a Trump loyalist as I am and that sort of thing. Meanwhile, you've got a president who NBC News SurveyMonkey poll today says has a 45% approval rating. So is Trump...
That's the new high point.
Is Trump completely taken over the Republican Party? And if so, how?
Yeah, yes, he has.
But with a 45% approval rating, and that's a high.
But in those national polls, you know what they do? They interview all voters. If you come out taking over the Republican Party, he has an 85, 86% approval rating among Republicans. That's pretty damn good. He has a rock-solid, hardcore Republican base that is not going to leave him, that loves the fight he has taken to Washington, he's taking to the press, he's taking to Comey. They love what he's doing. So they are, we asked a question on that NBC News Wall Street Journal poll of Republicans. Do you consider yourself more to be kind of a regular Republican or a Trump Republican? By 2-1, Republican voters are Trump Republicans. It is his Republican Party now. So absolutely, he's taken over the party, and you see that in advertising here in the state, and you see it in Ohio's no different from any other state in that regard.
This is a state that 2 years ago voted for John Kasich in the primary too.
John, yeah, I think that would be more of a challenge for John today.
I think if Kasich were on the ballot, he could win a third term. He's not eligible to, but if he were on the November ballot, he could win a third term. I don't know if he could win a primary though in the state anymore.
Nomination?
No, I don't. If he had a credible opponent, I don't think so. It's amazing that John Kasich was elected 2010 when he came into office, very polarizing figure, hated by Democrats. Now his approval rating is the same amongst Democrats and Republicans based on a lot of polling that I've seen, and so he's still broadly popular, but he's also kind of a man without a party, and it's interesting that in that, Kasich ran as the candidate closest to the center, I think, in the 2016 presidential race, but I don't think anyone would call him a moderate per se, and it gets at this difference in the Republican Party now, which may have a little bit less to do with policy than it has to do with, I think, tone, and basically Trump was a hellraiser, and a lot of the candidates were trying to be like Trump. I would say in this state, Mary Taylor is running this kind of campaign. A lot of congressional candidates like Melanie Lenahan, who's running up in the Ohio 12 special that's coming up. They're running these kind of like hellraiser, anti-establishment candidates, but ultimately I don't know how much different they really are on policy with their fellow Republicans.
Yeah, but Trump's approval rating here in the state among Republicans is 87-10. And then you look at, John Kasich, his image in the state was damaged by the fact that after the convention of 2016, you're right, Kyle. His numbers are stronger. His numbers are stronger among Democrats than they are among Republicans.
So what does that say, do you think, about the Republican Party? I want to talk about the Democrats, too, but the Republican Party in the primary, what do you think the results on Tuesday are going to say about the party here in Ohio?
I think the party's going to be alive and well. I mean, it's number one, alive and well. Secondly, it's Trump's party. And third, you see these divisions within the Republican Party in a very similar way you see divisions within the Democratic Party. Our primaries are dominated by the right, and the Democratic primaries are dominated by the left. And then it's a challenge to see which candidates can then appeal to the middle in the general election. And I think this year, given where Mike DeWine is, I think he's going to win the Republican primary, and I think Cordray is going to win the Democratic primary. They both have a ways to go to get to that middle.
I do think that we know that on the Republican side, because this played out during the Obama years, that Republican base voters are pretty suspicious of their leadership. And they're still suspicious of their leadership, I guess, except for Trump. That's how I would look at it anyway. We don't necessarily know that yet, I think, on the Democratic side. I think that we're gonna find out in these primaries. If somebody like Dennis Kucinich were to win the Democratic nomination for governor here in Ohio, it would indicate that maybe Democrats are sort of going for, and I keep using this word, these Hellraiser kind of candidates. I mean, certainly, the state party has not officially endorsed Richard Cordray, but we know that state Democrat, the bulk of state Democrats, the bulk of national Democrats prefer somebody like Cordray to be the nominee. Full disclosure, I used to work for Cordray when he was AG in 09 and 10, but I'm not up here to carry water for him. But certainly there's this kind of insider versus outsider thing going on in the Democratic Party right now. It's just not clear to me that Democrats are rejecting the so-called insiders the way they have been on the Republican side, but the jury's kind of out on that. A primary like Tuesday's in Ohio will help answer that question, I think, for us.
And I think what the environment is telling us is voters still want change. They're still not happy with the way and this is despite the fact that voters here in Ohio believe the state's headed in the right direction. A majority of voters in the state think the state's headed in the right direction. A majority of voters approve of the job that John Kasich's doing, approve of the job the state legislature is doing, but they still want to elect candidates who are going to bring change.
Now, I want to actually move not only through the primary, but also to the fall. And I want to know what kind of, this forum's about political megatrends. So what kind of political megatrends are you looking for in the primary that might indicate what might happen this fall?
One thing I'm very curious about, and I think it's the key to this November election, is what happens in eastern Ohio in the Mahoning Valley, so Youngstown and Warren, and then also down the Ohio River in places like Steubenville, Belmont County, Monroe County, et cetera. Those are places that Democrats used to carry, and now they don't. And in fact, as a shameless plug, I have a piece coming in our Crystal Ball newsletter tomorrow, which you can sign up for free. But I have a map.
Today only.
Today only, yeah. We take donations too. I have two maps in there, and one of them is of the Mike DeWine, Richard Cordray AG's race from 2010, which is very competitive. And that race kind of had some of the patterns we were used to in Ohio politics in that, Democrats, of course, win Cleveland, they win Youngstown and Warren, they do increasingly well in Columbus, and then there's a lot of blue in Southeast Ohio. If you look at then the Trump versus Clinton map, Southeast Ohio is basically entirely red, except for the home of my alma mater, Ohio University, the People's Republic of Athens. That's it. There's that little blue dot there, and that's it. And so all those places that were ancestrally Democratic going back to the Great Depression, they've moved away. And if Sherrod Brown and Richard Cordray or Dennis Kucinich can't get them back, then Ohio is just gone for Democrats because you can't make up, even though like Cincinnati is more Democratic than it used to be, and so is Central Ohio. You can't just win the three big cities in this state and expect to win. That's different. In Illinois, you could win basically just by winning Chicago and the suburbs, but it just doesn't work that way in Ohio. And so there's got to be some regeneration for Democrats in the eastern part of the state.
All right. So what I'm looking at turnout, not necessarily the margins, but the percent of Democrats, Republicans, Independents who turn out. And the reason I say that, having lived through all these, I'm old, so I've lived through all these midterm elections. And I mean, and what turns midterm elections, you have two things. Number one, there's a turnout disparity between the party that has the wave with them and the party that doesn't. That's number one. And secondly, independents usually go with the party that has the wave. So I'm looking at the special elections that have been held so far this year and the election last year in Virginia for governor, which is now my home state. Ed Gillespie, the Republican candidate for governor of Virginia, received more votes in the history of the state than more votes than any other Republican in the history of the state. More votes. He won, right? Oh, no, he didn't. He lost by 8 points. It's like, oh, my God. So Republicans turned out at high levels. Democrats turned out at plus 30 levels. It is that kind of disparity that we're seeing in these special elections, across the country, from my home state of Kansas, to Pennsylvania. I mean, you're seeing Democratic enthusiasm go through the roof, and that's what I'm looking at and it's more in suburban, higher educated areas. I can't think of any here in Ohio. Well, maybe Franklin County. No, I'm kidding. This is ground zero. Franklin County. I mean, this is like ground zero for where we're going to see that kind of increase in Democratic vote. And I think that's going to push some key races.
Well, that's interesting because it seems like there are two electorates that come out: the electorate that comes out in presidential years, and the electorate that comes out in these midterm years, these gubernatorial years. And it has trended more toward the Republicans in gubernatorial years, right?
Turnout, typically, generally speaking, turnout in a presidential nationally is 55, 60%, something like that. In a midterm, maybe it's more like 35 to 40. It was 2014 had a very low turnout, and actually that hit really hard here in Ohio because the Democrats basically didn't, they essentially abdicated the governor's race by running Ed Fitzgerald. And John Kasich boosted his share of the vote by about 15 percentage points from last time, even though in terms of raw votes, he basically only got, it was like 10 or 20,000 votes more. And it's because Democrats just had no reason to show up. Democrats do have a reason to show up this time. And I think that instead of 2014 being this really low turnout both in Ohio and nationally, I think that turnout is going to be higher this time across the board everywhere, maybe more like over 40%. I don't know if you have any projection on that, Neil, but I think it's going to be higher.
40% for the primary?
No, for the general. It's the midterm general turnout was I think 35 or 36 in 2014. I think it's going to be higher. And to Neil's point, it's like in 2014, Republican turnout was here, Democratic turnout was here. Now it might be like this, that was very helpful to Democrats in Virginia. Now, granted, Virginia is a kind of higher education, higher income state, particularly in Northern Virginia. There aren't a ton of places like Northern Virginia across the country, although I would say that Franklin County is one of them. Despite, if you assess the wreckage of the Clinton 2016 campaign, there are some bright spots, including Clinton carried like Dublin and Upper Arlington, which Democrats typically don't do. It's just that, she made some gains in this part of the state, but then she just got slaughtered in all over the state, really outside the three big urban counties.
So, Karen, let me a couple of points. Not rebutting anything that you said. I mentioned earlier Trump's numbers among Republicans in the state. So, they're good, 87 to 10 or so. That's important. It's important for primaries, but what's important in turnout in the general election is his approval rating among Democrats is like 95 to 5 against. And Democrats are much more strongly in opposition to him than Republicans are in support of him. In fact, nationally, and as well as in Ohio, I believe, voters who strongly disapprove of the president outnumber those who totally approve of the president. We saw that during the Obama years. In 10 and 14, the other thing we also saw with Obama was his voters didn't come out to support his party's candidates in those midterm elections. The question is, in 18, will Trump's voters, who came out in droves, in 16, will they come out to support Republican candidates? And that's open for debate.
Now, Kyle, you've rated Ohio as leaning R for governor, and then you are saying there are only 5 safe Republican seats for Congress. You have Gibbs, Turner, Joyce, Stivers, and Renacci, likely Republicans. Shabbat and the vacant 12th as leaning Republicans. Does that mean that there's an opening here for Democrats, or what does that mean to you?
I do think there is an opening for Democrats. So look, I mean, whatever happens, with this redistricting amendment, obviously that will change the process for the post 2020 census. When it looks like Ohio's probably going to lose another House seat, maybe will, maybe won't. And of course, that would mean losing an electoral vote too. So it's going from 18 to 17. But this particular House map was drawn by Speaker Boehner, and it was drawn by Ohio legislative Republicans, and it was designed to elect 12 Republicans and 4 Democrats. And in 2012, 2014, 2016, it did that successfully. Now, though, this is a different kind of environment, as we've been talking about. We have a different president of a different party in the White House. History tells us that the president's party just sort of suffers in the midterm. There have been 39 midterms since the Civil War. The president's party has lost ground in the House in 36 of them. And sometimes the losses are quite large, sometimes they're minor, but certainly 06, 10, and 14 were big wave years in favor of either party. And so I think that the first one to look at is this Ohio 12, because it's some of the territory that we were just talking about in terms of kind of high education, affluent growing suburbs, the kinds of places that probably might prefer a Republican like Mitt Romney over a Republican like Donald Trump. And we've seen these special elections across the country in Republican-leaning seats where Democrats have run well ahead of what Clinton did. Trump won the district by about 11 points. I think it should be a very, very competitive race. And there are, I've also, that Ohio 1, which is Steve Shabat's seat, which he lost a version of it in the 08 wave. That should be a competitive seat too, and there may be some other ones. And here's the thing about, a gerrymander, like it's designed to operate at efficiency at certain levels, so in like a neutral year, obviously this map's going to lack 12 Republicans. But what if it's like a Democratic plus 10 kind of environment? Well, then the map may fall apart. And that's when you could see lots of things happening, maybe in the State House, maybe at Congress. And again, we're not at that point yet, but I think you have to at least allow yourself the possibility for something like that to happen for the Democrats if it's a really big year.
I feel like I need to channel Steve Stivers here. The Republican Ohio Congressman, who's chairman of the Republican Campaign Committee, he said the other day, we will not lose a seat in the state. And I think I'm going to rest on that one. But let me give you something else to think about in terms of the blue wave going across the country. There's a relationship, hopefully this doesn't get too esoteric, a relationship between mood of the country, president, and presidential approval. The percentage of Americans who believe the country's headed in the right direction is a direct kind of sense of how they feel about the president. For the past, since 1980, and I've gone back and looked at every single poll done that tested right direction presidential approval, the average gap between right direction and presidential approval is around 15 or 16 points. So if the president's at 35%, if right direction, the country's heading in the right direction at 35%, presidential approval is around 50. Right now, right direction is around 34%. Presidential approval is 41. There's an artificial lid kind of on Donald Trump, maybe not artificial, but there's a lid because of his personal characteristics. Voters just can't see themselves to vote for him. But there has never been a wave election in modern history, going back to 1980, where there was a wave election with that right direction number above 35, 36%. If the economy continues to grow, if the North Korea kind of summit takes place, if things in the country continue going in the right direction, and you've got a 38 to 40% right direction number, do we still have a wave election, or is that somewhat mitigated, regardless of where the president is? That's another number I would encourage you all to look at instead of President Trump's job approval rating has ranged from 39 to 42% for the vast majority of his presidency. Take a look at that right direction number. If that keeps going up, then you might see that kind of hidden Trump vote saying, hey, I want to keep things the way they are.
And Neil, isn't it also true that the right direction is usually low? People are usually kind of pessimistic, that usually wrong direction is higher than right track.
Well, yeah, the lines haven't crossed in 14 years. 14 years. Now, and so it doesn't need, and that's in contrast. I mean, again, here in the state, 54% right direction in how the state's going. Nationally, they think it's probably around 33, 34, 35. But if that number just gets up to 40% right direction, as it did during when Obama was running for re-election, the Democratic Convention in 2012 drove that national right direction, wrong track number up like 6 points all by itself. And that was because of Bill Clinton's speech, of Obama's speech, that drove that sentiment up. Democrats thought things were heading in the right direction, and as part of the Romney campaign, we were basically left flat-footed. We couldn't capitalize on that negative sentiment.
It is interesting, too, that there are a lot of kind of positive signs. The baseline economic numbers are still pretty good, although those can be deceptive. Certainly, certain parts of this state and other states are doing better than others are. But also we're not in some sort of big foreign war right now or anything like that, and yet the president's approval rating is still really pretty lousy. And so it's interesting that
that's fake news.
Yeah, right. Sorry. I amend my previous comments. But I think a different president would probably have a positive approval rating right now. I mean, I don't know if we may be in an era where the parties are so polarized that there's this sort of tight band that presidents may be restricted to of between 55 and 35% or something. But
I think it's a function. Don't you think it's a function not just of the polarization of our politics, but I think you talked about in one of your sessions kind of the tribalization of our parties.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And there's a fancy political science term called negative partisanship. And it means that your political opinions are driven by hatred of the other side as opposed to really support for your own side. And I think that it's a major factor in both parties right now. And we talked about, Neil was talking about the difference between the strong approve and the strong disapprove of Trump, and how the strong disapprove is a lot higher than the strong approve of Trump. And look, I think anger, particularly in a midterm where the electorate is naturally going to be smaller and you need more motivated voters, anger is the best motivator there is, I think, and Democrats are mad.
I once read a good book called The Bellwether. And
many copies still available.
There you go.
Get them before they turn them into toilet paper.
There you go. But I'm wondering if you're looking at this year's election, is there anything that you're taking? We're 2 years out from the next presidential election. Is there anything that you're taking and looking at, thinking if Ohio is going to still be a bellwether? Is it going to be a purple state? Is it still going to be in that category, or is it a Republican state now?
I hate to be repetitive, but I want to go back to the Eastern Ohio point because, there are historically, a handful of very reliably Democratic counties in this state going back several decades. And, again, it's, Cuyahoga County, Franklin County is one of them now, Summit County where Akron is. Lorain County up in Northeast Ohio where Lorain and Elyria are. Donald Trump barely lost Lorain County. Democrats should win that county by double digits. Some of the counties in the state that typically do a pretty good job of reflecting the statewide vote, like Stark County, where Canton is, Trump won it by more than 15 points. And as Democrats in this state just cannot rely on the three big cities to get them through. And it's got to be the places like Youngstown and Warren and Ashtabula have to bounce back to some degree.
And Karen, I think it may be describing him a little bit differently. Rather than Republican or Democratic, whether the state's turning red or blue, it's turning Trump. And I think that's the difference. I mean, they may not vote for other Republican candidates, but they'll vote for Donald Trump. I mean, as Donald Trump has a 46% job approval here in Ohio. It's like 5 or 6 points above the national average. So it's good. Number one, you're better than average. It's good. But it is, this state is made up of much more than simply Franklin County, OSU, Delaware County, et cetera. I mean, this is a dead even state on Donald Trump, in the state that he won by 7 or 8 points in 2016. So I think the one takeaway I would encourage you, no matter what happens in November of 18, it doesn't mean squat for 2020.
I totally agree with that. And I think even if the Democrats were to have some sort of extraordinary election, pick up a bunch of House seats, et cetera, I think that Donald Trump would probably, regardless, start as the favorite to carry, the 18 electoral votes here in 2020, unless his national standing, declines very significantly from where it is now.
Now, we're going to move to audience questions in just a few minutes, so please go ahead and go up to the microphone if you've got a question. But while we're waiting for people to come up, I want to ask you one final question here. You brought it up, fake news. So I got to ask you about this whole idea of post-truth. Are we in a post-truth environment here where facts and evidence really mean nothing in the face of opinions and attitudes and spin? And how does that affect voters?
The image of the news media has changed so dramatically in the past, not just since in the Trump years, but even before that. It is voters don't know who the heck to believe anymore. I mean, they really don't. I mean, and I got to tell you, truthfully, watching CNN, sometimes I don't either. I mean, it used to be when we were growing up. My age at least, we got CBS, NBC, ABC. That's it. Main networks. And now you get the news that you want to hear. You fit your news consumption around what it is you want, around your own set political beliefs. So that Democrats watch, listen to NPR, watch MSNBC and CNN, and Republicans watch Fox. And it's self-reinforcing, so you're never going to get out of your box. It is unbelievably frustrating, and the way the press has been excoriated has not been good for the system. The way the press handled the correspondence dinner the other night was lousy for politics in D.C. in general. The system's broken.
I think one big difference between now and even maybe during the time of the 2006 election in Ohio, for instance, a dozen years ago, is that because of social media, essentially everyone is a publisher, and there is a lot of quote fake news floating around on the internet. Also, I think it's going to get worse. I mean, there have been some presentations recently about how you can fairly easily doctor video to make, hypothetically you'd have President Obama looking like he's talking about, growing up in Kenya or something, and it's just total BS. But that we may be seeing that, and given the tribalism we talked about how much people are inclined to believe bad stuff about people they don't like, combined with a flood of fake news that's basically designed to play to people's worst fears, not a great media combination.
Yeah, and I've seen some polling where a majority of Americans believe that news reporters slant their stories in favor of the people that the news reporter favors. I mean that it's just there's not a trust anymore of what people are seeing, reading, and hearing.
And yet there's a trust in a sense of this NBC News poll that I was just quoting. 45% approve of Trump. 22% of Republicans say he tells the truth only some of the time, but yet 56% of those Republicans still approve of his job performance.
Yeah.
He's their guy.
I guess that really kind of goes with what you were saying.
They love the fight he's making. They don't think he's right all the time.
Or truthful, apparently.
It's true. I mean, I don't know how to answer that, but they want to believe him. They think his head's in the right place in terms of where he's going and where he wants to take the country.
I'd also just say that I think what a lot of Trump did, to borrow the old joke from Spinal Tap, he took typical republicanism and turned it up to 11. In that Republicans have been critical of the media for a long time, I think justifiably in some instances. Over the past several years before Trump, there was more of a movement to be restrictionist on immigration. That's something that Trump turned up to 11. And so, when he is attacking the media in this really aggressive, I think, over-the-top way, he's kind of giving the people what they want to some degree, and a message that I think Republicans have sort of believe in and have been sort of conditioned to believe in even before Trump came along.
All right, it's CMC's tradition to take audience questions. Please state your name and ask your question. In fairness to all, we'd like to get as many questions as possible, so please avoid editorial comments. Put a question mark at the end of what you say. So let's get started. First question.
Hello, my name is John McKnight, And first of all, I love that Spinal Tap is now part of a political discussion. I think that's great. So it seems to me that the political ads right now that I'm seeing on television, it's like, if you're left, you're way left. If you're right, you're way right. And I seem to notice more of the way right stuff, my own perspective. Are we going to see that in the general election? I mean, we've got, camos and cowboy hats and the guy showing us the proper disposal method of television sets and all this stuff on TV. That's just, it seems like it's really far either way. Is that just the nature of the primary, or is that going to be that way through the whole election?
What's interesting is I think what you're going to see in the general election is the Republican candidate wanting to continue to push that Democrat far left, and a Democrat wanting to continue to push that Republican far right. So they want to keep your opponent. You want to keep your opponent as far out as you possibly can, while you edge the middle. So you'll still it'll be the same kind of advertising, but a little different edge.
It seems like the talk of the primary season in terms of one single ad here in Ohio is Larry Householder's house ad where he's dressed in camo and he shoots that television. Apparently they don't have any new televisions in Perry County. I don't know, but Householder, it's just fascinating that he's taking this sort of what I was talking about, this Hellraiser outsider image. I mean, Householder was the Speaker of the House in this state for 4 years in the 2000s, and is an immensely powerful person in the Republican Party, and sort of almost your definition of this kind of insider. Yet he wants to make sure that he proves or can claim some outsider bona fides. And I mean, even in the in the governor's races on both sides, I mean, all of the major candidates are people who've been in public life forever. I mean, Cordray's been elected to a lot of things, won and lost a lot of times. Kucinich was in the House for a long time. Mike DeWine's been in public office for longer than I've been alive. I mean,
you can stop there.
Yeah, but again, I mean, there's this idea that you want to sort of say you're an outsider even though you've been around forever.
Next question.
Okay, David Scott. Hypothetical, Trump engineers the firing of Mueller or Rosenstein. There will be an instantaneous and enormous outpouring from progressive groups pushing Democrats on impeachment and trying to make impeachment an issue. Any thoughts on how that might play out or affect the election?
The more that the Democrats make impeachment an issue in the run-up to the 18 election, the more it's going to turn out Trump voters. So I think that plays to his advantage. I think the White House understands pretty well that if Democrats do win the House, that he could very well be impeached. But you remember what happened when Bill Clinton was impeached. His approval numbers went up because Democrats and some independents came to his defense. So I would imagine that and remember, Donald Trump loves to have an enemy to fight against. He loves to demonize somebody. Imagine if the Democrats try to impeach him, what fun he'll have with Nancy Pelosi.
I agree that in some ways you wonder if there may even be, if Trump may make a calculation that firing Mueller is actually good for him, not just from a legal standpoint, but also from a motivation standpoint. I mean, I don't know, but the Republicans are desperate, I think, for something to get their voters, particularly the Trump voters who may be lower propensity midterm voters, to show up. And how you do that, I don't know. It's a hard problem, but one wonders how that might actually shake out.
Next question.
Hello, I'm John Brody. Your analysis relies so much on polling, as it should. The last election revealed, shall we say, some flaws in polling. Has it been fixed?
I have no idea what you're talking about. I mean, the last election I was involved in was issue 2 last year, and we nailed it. I don't know what you're talking about. The funny thing is the national polls in 2016 were right on. Hillary won the popular vote. Didn't quite pick up that movement in some of those other states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, et cetera. You know what? I'm not sure we have fixed that. I went back in the field immediately after the election in 2016 in, I think, Michigan and California doing a post-election survey. We asked the question of Trump voters, during this campaign, were you ever embarrassed to tell others you were supporting Donald Trump? 36% of voters said yes. 36% of his base basically said, I really don't want to tell people about this. And I think people simply lied to us on the phone and those things. They just simply, they didn't want to admit that they were voting for the guy. How we get at that, I'm not the hell sure. I mean, I think right now, I think probably his job approval rating is probably a few ticks lower than it ought to be based on that same kind of sentiment. So we've actually started asking a question. Among voters who disapprove of the president, agree or disagree, even though I disapprove of the job the president's doing, I approve of some of his policies. To get at that kind of, to allow people to say yes. And his numbers go back up. But have we fixed that? I'm not sure we've fixed it. I mean, we're sure as hell trying. And we're dialing, 40 to 50% of our phone calls we do a poll are done by cell phone. We're reaching out to people on cell phones. So we're trying to fix it. It's a challenge.
And I just want to say, too, as a reporter, when I would go out and talk to people in 2016, I found the same thing, that Democrats were very willing to talk about their support of Hillary Clinton, Republicans less willing to talk about their support of Trump. So,
one little point about the polls just is that the specific number in terms of, the ballot number, Trump's at 50, Clinton's at 45 in a given state. That's really important because a little shift one way or the other could mean that the poll could, quote, be wrong and that, Clinton would win or whatever. But in these national approval polls, what is functionally the difference between Trump at 41 or Trump at maybe it's a little bit low and it's actually 43? It's still bad. There's some margin of error here. But we have a bulk of data that suggests that I do think the president is actually unpopular. His popularity is a little bit better than it was, but his approval is not somehow positive. It's not like it's 10 points higher and that we're missing a huge segment of the electorate. I don't believe that's true.
Yeah, nobody's, on our side of the aisle, nobody's buying the Rasmussen numbers. So.
Next question.
Yeah, Bob Bracco, you talked a lot about Republican and Democrat voters. What about the unaffiliated and independent voters? How do you see them affecting these elections, both primary and the general election?
Well, if I could reference back our Crystal Ball newsletter, we actually have a piece about this tomorrow.
Subscriptions available
Subscriptions
today.
available. We have my piece on Ohio and a second piece about third-party voters and how a lot of them broke away from Republicans, particularly in suburban areas, to vote for Gary Johnson or Evan McMullin in the presidential election. Johnson got several points worth of support across the country. But a lot of those voters stayed home down the ballot. They voted for their local congressperson or in a governor's race or what have you. But there may be some indications that without a presidential vote on the ballot, that those voters may be more inclined to vote against the White House because they may have some Republican leanings, but they don't like the president, and the midterm can be kind of a backlash year. And so I think that's a sort of a hidden maybe danger point for Republicans, maybe some of those third-party voters.
One interesting thing is when we ask your party affiliation, we ask, you generally consider yourself to be Republican, Democrat, or Independent, and then ask if you're Republican, strong Republican, not so strong. Same thing on Democratic side. Independents, we ask, do you lean Republican, lean Democrat, or kind of hard Independent? What we find is independents who lean Republican or independents who lean Democrat are stronger in their partisan ties to their party than those people who say, I'm a Republican, but I'm a weak Republican, or I'm a Democrat and a weak Democrat. So that the number of true independents, pretty damn low. It's not that 35, 40%. It's more like 10 or 12%. And so it's interesting the way people, so independents who lean Republican are pretty darn Republican. Independents who lean Democrat are pretty strong Democrats.
As we get ready to, we've been early voting now since April 10th, but the results will come next week. And I'm just wondering, as you're looking at everything, I think people could say that Donald Trump's win over Hillary Clinton here in Ohio was either a surprise or a wake-up call, depending on your point of view. Do you think that's going to show in the primary vote? Do you think that is turnout going to be 30% like it usually is? Do you think there's going to be, you folks have talked a little bit about motivation and people wanting to go out and vote. Is it going to turn out?
The Democrats want to go out and beat Republicans. I mean, I don't think there's a lot of energy right now behind the
You
governor.
don't think that race, that Cordray, Kucinich, O'Neill, Schiavone race is motivating Democrats?
Have you seen all the advertising they're running? Me neither. I don't. I think you're going to see it in the fall. I don't think you're going to see it in the primaries. That's when voters are going to get motivated, and that's when they're motivated because it's a national election. That's when they're going to come out, and what's coming out of Washington, what they're seeing on the nightly news is going to help drive that.
We shouldn't. I think sometimes analysts, because we're dying to look at any possible numbers we can look at. We sometimes look at early voting numbers, and there have been some that have come out in Ohio that Secretary of State Husted's office put out. In fact, I think he just had a report yesterday. And because of the way we vote in Ohio, your party quote registration or affiliation is just whatever ballot you take. And so Republicans have this huge advantage in the state at the moment because way more people voted in the Republican presidential primary in 2016. What we are seeing is that so far, with the relatively small number of ballots returned, it's in the hundreds of, about a little over 100,000. There are more Democratic ballots returned than Republican ones, which maybe suggests that there's more interest in the Democratic side or what have you. But I don't know if that really means anything.
One final question. So John Kasich, the consensus is he wouldn't win a primary if he were on the ballot. What does all this say about his possible campaign for president? Though he's not running for president, apparently, but he sure is doing a lot of national media.
I think he's going to be a terrific commentator on CNN.
Maybe be a spoiler in New Hampshire and get 35% or something, but I don't think he can wage a national campaign against Donald Trump.
All right. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
It's great talking to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I hope you found today's forums informative. I know I did. You can view and share today's forum and all of our forums on CTV Columbus Television, on WOSU and PBS affiliates statewide through the Ohio channel, and anytime on CMC's website via YouTube. Please help me thank our sponsors, Hannah News Service and the Ohio Farm Bureau Federation. And let's thank our speakers, Neil Newhouse, Kyle Kondik, and Karen Kasler. And thanks to you for being here. We'll see you next week.